Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with If I Could Choose Only One Work by composer X, it would have to be work V. Composer X is Paul DUKAS. Now, DUKAS is one of those enigmatic figures in the history of music because he's known today as a one-shot wonder, the one shot being, of course, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, one of the absolutely great orchestral works, all time. But he only wrote masterpieces, and there are only about a dozen of them. I mean, there's some little short sniglets, and there are also some early works that have lately been rediscovered and performed, and they kind of suck. So he knew what he was about. He really knew what he was doing. He was extremely self-critical, and it really is kind of fascinating if you look at what survives, because there's one of everything. There's one overture, one symphony, one piano sonata, one set of variations, one ballet, one opera, one, and so forth, one symphonic poem, and so it goes. He just decided that's what was the best of him, and so that's what he was going to permit to survive and to represent him. And he knew what he was talking about. He really, really did. I don't see a lot of people screaming that, oh God, I wish there were more DUKAS. I mean, he's not the kind of composer who I think was going to compose gobs of populist music so that people would say, I want more Gershwin, for example, I mean, we do want more Gershwin because, what we have is obviously so much less than what he was capable of doing or was going to be capable of doing. But DUKAS had a long and fulfilling life. He was a very, very important teacher. I mean, he taught people, among others, people like Messiaen and Walter Piston, and he had a very, very strong influence. He was a conservative but not dogmatic force in French music at the turn of the 20th century. Really an important guy. And his music, what fascinates me is that when a guy writes only like a dozen pieces and one of them is like totally fabulous, amazing, you'd think everybody would want to hear the rest of them, wouldn't you? But it doesn't really work out that way. We hear The Sorcerer's Apprentice, of course, gets played to death, and to a certain extent the ballet La Pairie, which is marvelous, and the fanfare from the beginning, which is a favorite of like brass ensembles all over the universe. And then we get to hear even today, there are two recordings now, amazingly, of the opera Ariane et Barbe Bleue, Ariane and Bluebeard, which is a masterpiece, an absolutely gorgeous work. And finally, work V, which we have chosen to present to Cancresans, the evil god who's going to destroy all of classical music, but for one work per composer, and that is the Piano Sonata. And that may shock some people. The Piano Sonata is not the easiest piece to digest. It is huge. It is the Hammerklavier Sonata of France. I mean, that's what it is. It's an extraordinary piece. It's big. It's like 40 minutes long. It's harmonically gnarly. It's an E-flat minor. It's not a love at first sight kind of work. You really have to get into it, but it is extraordinary, like all of DUKAS' larger works. And the reason we have to choose it as the most typical of his pieces is because it shows him doing something that most people don't want to give him credit for, which is wrestling with large forms, at which he was quite successful. I mean, you hear that in his symphony, which is magnificent. You hear that in the Piano Sonata. You hear that in the Rameau variations. He did write in large forms, and he was in his own marvelous way. He was not a member specifically of the school of Vincent d'Indy and César Franck, although the symphony is in 3 movements. It's a Frankian type symphony. He wasn't necessarily wedded to cyclical form in the way that Franck used it and those folks did. He was his own guy. And we have to give him credit for being his own guy. And if hearing the Piano Sonata means that we're going to lose The Sorcerer's Apprentice when Cancresans destroys all of classical music, but for one work per composer, I happen to know that Cancresans loves The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So I said, let's stick it to the old bastard and give him one of DUKAS' tougher pieces, something that requires some thought, some intellectual addendum to the usual experience of passive listening that so many of us tend to indulge in, and force him to take that into account and to face the loss of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Because remember, the Sorcerer's Apprentice is very much of the Cancressan's threat kind of work. It's about a sorcerer who tells his apprentice to do something. He doesn't, he gets in trouble. Well, that's what's happening with the world of classical music and the god Cancressan's. It's getting in trouble. And so he likes to chuckle over the end when the apprentice gets his ass kicked. Well, he's not the only one who can do a little ass kicking, and forcing him to digest the DUKAS piano sonata is just the ticket. And it's also just a ticket, I think, for a lot of people who think that there are no great French piano sonatas, because there are, and DUKAS is primus inter pares. It is certainly the greatest one, frankly, that probably has been written to date. And it is a remarkable, remarkable piece. Glorious, glorious piece that requires a certain amount of attention and dedication. And the fact that it's easy the fact that it's not easy, pardon me, doesn't mean that it isn't great. That it certainly is. So there it is, my friends. Keep on listening and take care.